So here we're going to take a look at your I/O, your ins and out in your Pro Tools session. The first thing actually you want to make sure is in your setup you have all these different options. You have a hardware, playback engine, and the I/O. If you have an issue where your playback is coming out from the wrong source, here's your playback engine. As you can see on top here, we are selected to be on an HDX, which is the Pro Tools HDX system. If it's on anything else in here, you see you have Pro Tools Aggregate, built-in I/O, and your display audio, or this USB mic, you're not coming out of the right source probably. If you want to utilize the powers of the HD system, here's where you would change that. You also can change other things as you for your system to run better. Your buffer size can be changed here. Buffer size has to do with a lower buffer size, you have less latency problems. So if you put 64 samples, it will read 64 samples into the system before you can before it spits out, and then a higher number, 1024 for example, that's a good setting for a hardware buffer size when you're mixing, because you need more resources for your plugins, etc. So this playback engine is where you would go to change your playback engine and also some of these different settings. Your voices are the number of really tracks that you have for this system. Okay? And occasionally you have to enable the video engine here if case it's disabled. That's where you do that. So first, make sure that you are coming out of the right source. If you're coming out of anything else, you won't be coming out of Pro Tools or the speakers. I/O is looking at the ins and out of your hardware. Whatever the hardware is that you're using, it's looking for that in and out. So as you can see here, my I/O, these are my inputs from the HD I/O, and these are my output. Now the output often changes, so if I come from outside the school back in here and I'm trying to do something, or something is not working, it is very likely that you need to set up your I/O here. And the way the system that we have here, we use this thing called a monitor path. Monitor path and audition path is something you need to keep an eye on in case something is not correct. Audition path is where it's playing back from when you're using your auditioning, which is basically if you're importing an audio track, you need to play back and hear it, or if you're in the workspaces, you need to be able to hear it back. And what is that coming out of? So here in your I/O is where you see how things are set up. So if it's set up incorrect, you might have to go in and set this I/O up. Right? So these, for example, I'm not using. I can delete paths that I'm not using. I can see how it's laid out. In this case, we're using, this may not be correct either. So if I were to, we can delete the paths, set up the correct path. If I have everything is off, I need to I can go to the default. It will say the default path for this room. And you can also then change if something is not correct with the I/O. You can change how it's sent out. And then as you see, if my I/O is completely off here, I don't see anything. The I/O is not being sent anywhere. If it's grayed out, it has no output to send it to. So in this case, you can send all them out to a stereo like that, and now I have an output. Be cautious when you do this, however, when you go up into the I/O. If you select to delete all your buses, for example, and I have buses, so I'm going to show you what happens. If I go and I've made a very advanced busing system, I have a bunch of stereo buses here. I have 10 of them with all different kinds of routing. So say I have this auxiliary buses here. You see how they're using a bus for the in and out. And if I went up here into my I/O now and say, you can see that the ones that are being used are boldface here. If I say I'm going to delete these buses, delete path, 6 of the selected buses are currently being used, and I hit delete, guess what? Now, when I get out and say OK, the buses disappeared. It doesn't go anywhere. So the auxiliary here, you've lost that bus. There's no input and no output. That means if I've sent it somewhere, they're lost. When you do have a busing system that you've created, just make sure before you delete any of the buses, in your I/O, when you hit delete path, do you want to delete this? Maybe you don't. One thing with buses as well is that you can label the buses. Here, you can rename the buses. If I double click on it, I can rename it. I can call this drums and etc. or reverb or cello. Now, when I go out, here and I want to send this group perhaps to a bus, I can send this to the drum bus. And then, of course, when you send something, you have to feed it back into the system, and then the drums will come out here. You can also rename a bus or an input or anything really here by right-clicking on the output or the input of it. You can rename this input and output. Goes for busing or for the output. So if I rename this output, this bus output called 1 and 2 now, to guitars, it's renamed. That's very useful when you're working on the flow. So that's something to be very cautious of. Before you start deleting your busing, make sure it's not being used in the setup here. And keep an eye on where things are coming out. Hopefully that helps.